Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Sienna stood at the center of the storm she had deliberately summoned, her spine straight and her chin lifted as if the weight of the truth she was about to unleash had already hardened her into something unbreakable, and as the room filled with the sharp intake of breath from those gathered, Kyle pacing near the window, Sharon clutching the arm of the sofa, Victor's eyes narrowed with a predator's focus, and Audra seated with an air of cultivated calm that had fooled everyone for far too long. Sienna began to speak, not with hysteria or desperation but with the slow, methodical precision of someone who had spent months assembling a puzzle whose final image would destroy a life, explaining how Noah's accident had never been an accident at all, how the night everyone remembered as a tragic convergence of rain, poor visibility, and bad luck was in fact a carefully orchestrated sequence of manipulations engineered by Audra, who had played the part of the grieving, worried partner so convincingly that even Noah himself, lying broken in a hospital bed, had blamed fate instead of the woman who claimed to love him, and Sienna described how Audra had first planted the seed weeks earlier by subtly encouraging Noah's recklessness, praising his late-night drives as proof of his dedication, dismissing his concerns about exhaustion, and framing every hesitation as weakness, all while quietly ensuring that he remained emotionally isolated from anyone who might have urged caution, and then Sienna moved on to the evidence, revealing phone records Audra had assumed were erased, messages sent to a private number instructing a hired intermediary to tamper with the guardrail on the coastal road Noah used that night, explaining how Audra had researched traffic patterns and weather forecasts to pick the perfect moment when rain would blur headlights and reduce witnesses. And as Sienna spoke she produced copies of encrypted emails Audra had sent from a burner account, emails that spoke chillingly of inevitable outcomes and necessary sacrifices, words that now echoed in the stunned silence of the room, and Audra's smile flickered for the first time, a microfracture in the porcelain mask, as Sienna detailed how Audra had manipulated Noah emotionally in the hours before the crash, provoking an argument designed to push him into leaving in a heightened emotional state, reminding everyone how Audra had called Kyle that night pretending to be worried when in reality she had been tracking Noah's car through an app she herself had installed under the guise of safety, and then Sienna addressed the motive, dismantling Audra's carefully curated narrative of devotion by exposing the ruthless calculus beneath it, explaining that Noah had become an obstacle to Audra's ambitions, that his growing independence threatened her control, and that the accident had been meant not to kill him outright but to weaken him, to make him dependent, malleable, and easier to steer. And when Victor demanded proof beyond words, Sienna provided it with forensic clarity, revealing a recorded confession from the intermediary who had been paid to sabotage the road barrier, a man now in custody who had identified Audra without hesitation, describing her icy composure and the way she spoke of Noah not as a person but as a variable to be managed, and the room seemed to contract as the implications sank in, Sharon's breath hitching as she realized the depth of the betrayal, Kyle's fists clenching as guilt flooded him for having defended Audra for so long, and even Victor, no stranger to ruthless tactics, appeared momentarily shaken by the cold intimacy of Audra's crime, and Sienna pressed on, recounting how Audra had ensured she would appear blameless in the aftermath by arriving at the hospital in a state of theatrical distress, how she had whispered reassurances into Noah's ear while silently calculating how long his recovery would take, how she had used his vulnerability to extract signatures, access accounts, and redirect loyalties, and Sienna described her own role, how she had initially suspected nothing, how she had been drawn into Audra's orbit and nearly consumed by it, until inconsistencies began to surface, timestamps that didn't align, security footage that had been altered, Audra's uncanny ability to predict developments before they happened, and how Sienna had risked everything to follow the thread, knowing that if Audra sensed even a hint of suspicion she would become the next problem to be solved, and as Audra finally rose from her seat, her composure cracking into sharp indignation, Sienna countered every denial with another piece of evidence, a bank transfer routed through shell companies, a voice note Audra had forgotten existed in which she spoke with chilling clarity about breaking Noah down so he can be rebuilt, and the transformation in Audra's face was almost imperceptible yet unmistakable, the practiced warmth draining away to reveal something colder, harder, and terrifyingly honest, and in that moment Sienna didn't shout or gloat but simply stated that Noah deserved the truth, that everyone deserved to know how deeply Audra's deception ran, how she had exploited love as a weapon, and the silence that followed was heavy with reckoning, broken only when Victor ordered security to detain Audra. When Kyle whispered Noah's name like a prayer and a curse intertwined, and as Audra was led away she locked eyes with Sienna, not with fear or remorse but with a calculating glare that promised this was not the end, and yet Sienna felt no doubt, only a grim certainty that whatever came next, the truth was now out, that Noah's suffering had been given a face and a name, and that Audra's carefully constructed empire of lies had finally begun to crumble under the weight of the very control she had believed would save her, leaving behind a legacy not of power but of exposure, consequence, and irreversible loss. And as the room slowly exhaled, Sienna remained standing, knowing that proving Audra was the mastermind behind Noah's accident was not just an act of justice but a declaration of war against the kind of darkness that hides behind love, a war she had chosen the moment she refused to stay silent, even if the cost would follow her for the rest of her life. In the aftermath of Audra's removal, the room did not immediately return to normal, because normal had been quietly dismantled piece by the truth Sienna had laid bare. And as the door closed behind Audra with a sound far too soft for the magnitude of what had just occurred, Sienna continued, her voice steadier now, deeper, as if unburdened by secrecy, explaining that the accident itself was only the most visible fracture in a structure of manipulation that Audra had been building around Noah for years, a slow suffocation disguised as protection, and she spoke of how Audra had isolated him socially by framing his friends as distractions and threats, subtly undermining Sharon's influence by questioning her judgment in moments when Noah was most vulnerable, and positioning herself as the sole interpreter of his needs, the only one who truly understood him. And Sienna described how this psychological groundwork was essential to the success of the plan, because when Noah drove down that rain-slicked road, he was already carrying the weight of doubt Audra had planted, already second-guessing his instincts, already primed to believe that whatever happened to him would be the result of his own flaws rather than someone else's design. And as Kyle demanded to know how Sienna could be so certain that Audra had intended for Noah to survive, Sienna answered without hesitation, citing a series of communications Audra had exchanged with a private medical consultant weeks before the crash, inquiries about recovery timelines for spinal trauma, about the likelihood of long-term impairment without fatality, questions chilling in their specificity, and she revealed that Audra had even arranged for a particular surgeon to be on call that night, ensuring that Noah would receive treatment that would save his life while leaving him dependent long enough for her to reshape his world around her will. And the realization spread through the room like a slow-burning fire. Because this was not impulsive cruelty but calculated domination, and Sienna went on to explain how Audra had monitored Noah's rehabilitation progress obsessively, not out of concern but strategy, adjusting her behavior as his strength returned, tightening her grip whenever he showed signs of independence, loosening it just enough to keep him compliant. And Sienna admitted that it was during this phase that her own doubts crystallized, when she noticed Audra's eyes flick not to Noah's face when he spoke of pain or fear but to the medical charts, the schedules, the leverage points, and Sienna recounted a night when she overheard Audra on the phone speaking in a low, controlled tone about contingency plans, about how another setback might be necessary if Noah began to remember details from the night of the crash that didn't align with the official story. And Sienna's hands trembled slightly as she confessed how close she had come to confronting Audra then, how instinct had warned her to stay silent, how fear had whispered that Audra was not someone who reacted well to exposure, and yet how the image of Noah struggling to walk, struggling to trust his own memories, had outweighed that fear. And she described the painstaking process of gathering proof, of copying files one by one, of meeting secretly with the intermediary who had first carried out Audra's instructions and later, racked with guilt and abandoned by Audra when the risk grew too great, had agreed to talk, and Sienna told them how Audra had attempted to erase her trail once she sensed danger, how accounts were closed, devices destroyed, narratives rewritten, but how arrogance had betrayed her, how Audra's belief in her own invincibility had led her to keep souvenirs of her success, recordings and notes that affirmed her control. And Sienna's voice cracked only once, when she admitted that Audra had tried to turn her into an accomplice, offering protection, power, and silence in exchange for loyalty. Framing Noah as weak, disposable, necessary collateral in a larger vision of dominance, and Sienna said she would never forget the moment she realized that Audra did not see herself as a villain, that she genuinely believed she was entitled to shape other people's lives according to her desires. And as the room absorbed this, Victor spoke quietly, not with outrage but with grim recognition, acknowledging that such minds were the most dangerous because they mistook control for destiny, and Sienna nodded, adding that Audra's final mistake had been underestimating the resilience of truth, believing that fear would keep everyone compliant forever, and she revealed that Noah himself had begun to remember fragments, the way the headlights ahead of him had suddenly veered, the unnatural give of the guardrail, the feeling that the road itself had been altered, and how Audra had dismissed these memories as trauma-induced fantasies, gently gaslighting him into doubting his own mind, and Sienna described the night she decided to reveal everything, how she had watched Audra stroke Noah's hair and whisper reassurances while her eyes reflected calculation instead of care, and how Sienna had felt something harden inside her, a refusal to let this continue, and as Sharon finally found her voice, asking in a trembling whisper what would happen now, Sienna answered that justice would take its course, but healing would be slower, because the deepest wound Audra inflicted was not physical but existential, the theft of Noah's sense of agency, and Sienna emphasized that reclaiming that would require truth, support, and time, not silence or convenient forgetting, and she promised that every piece of evidence had already been delivered to the authorities, that Audra's resources could delay but not erase the consequences, and as the conversation shifted from shock to resolve, Sienna reflected inwardly on the cost of what she had done, knowing that Audra's removal did not mean Audra's influence would vanish overnight, knowing that retaliation could still come in subtler forms, but also knowing that for the first time since the accident, the story belonged to Noah again, not to the woman who had rewritten his pain into her advantage, and when Noah himself finally entered the room, supported but standing, his presence brought a fragile stillness, and Sienna met his gaze with honesty, not pity, as she told him that the accident was not his fault, that his suffering was not random, and that the truth, however brutal, was the first step toward reclaiming his life, and as Noah listened, his expression moving through disbelief, anger, grief, and finally a quiet clarity, Sienna understood that proving Audra was the mastermind behind the accident was not the end of the story but the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple through every relationship Audra had touched, exposing not only her crimes but the complacency that had allowed her to thrive, and as the room slowly emptied, leaving behind the echo of truths too heavy to be ignored, Sienna remained, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones, yet beneath it a fierce resolve, because she had chosen to stand against a darkness that wore the mask of love, and whatever shadows lay ahead, she knew she had already crossed the point of no return, not as a victim of Audra's schemes, but as the one who had finally dismantled them, piece by piece, word by word, until the lie collapsed under its own weight. Long after the others had gone, after the house had settled into a deceptive quiet that made every truth spoken within its walls feel almost unreal, the consequences of Sienna's revelation continued to unfold in ways both subtle and seismic, because truth, once released, does not move in straight lines but seeps into cracks, reshaping foundations. And in the days that followed Audra's arrest, the narrative the world had accepted for so long began to unravel publicly, news outlets revisiting the accident with fresh eyes, investigators re-examining evidence that had once been dismissed as circumstantial, and whispers turning into undeniable fact as more individuals came forward, emboldened by the knowledge that Audra's power was no longer absolute, and Sienna found herself both at the center of this reckoning and strangely peripheral to it, watching as the story she had guarded for so long took on a life of its own, while Noah, the man whose pain had been weaponized, struggled to reconcile the woman he had loved with the architect of his suffering, and Sienna understood that for him the truth was not a clean blade but a jagged one, cutting away lies while reopening wounds he had barely learned to endure, and she stayed close not as a savior but as a witness, answering questions when he asked, remaining silent when words would only intrude on the slow reconstruction of his trust in reality itself. And Noah began to speak of memories returning with alarming clarity. Sensations he had once buried now surfacing with vivid intensity, the smell of rain-soaked asphalt, the sickening lurch of the car as the guardrail gave way too easily, the eerie calm that followed the impact, and each recollection confirmed what Sienna had proven, yet also deepened his grief, because remembering meant acknowledging that the betrayal had been intimate, deliberate, and unrepentant, and as legal proceedings advanced, Audra's defense attempted to reframe the narrative, casting Sienna as a manipulator driven by jealousy or ambition, questioning her motives, dissecting her past for any flaw that could be weaponized, and Sienna endured it with a composure that surprised even herself, because she had already survived Audra's scrutiny once, had already felt the cold appraisal of someone deciding whether you were useful or expendable. And she refused to let the same tactics work again, and when she took the stand, her testimony was devastating not because it was emotional but because it was precise, methodical, and unyielding, a mirror held up to Audra's actions that left little room for doubt, and Audra, seated just feet away, watched with a gaze that flickered between contempt and calculation, as if still searching for leverage even now, still unwilling to accept that control had finally slipped beyond her grasp, and yet. There were moments when her mask faltered, when Sienna mentioned Noah's pain or the intermediary's confession, moments so brief they might have gone unnoticed had Sienna not been trained by months of observation to catch every micro-expression, and she wondered then not whether Audra felt remorse, but whether she felt affronted, offended by the idea that her design had been exposed, and outside the courtroom, relationships strained and shifted, Kyle grappling openly with his guilt, Sharon navigating the fragile balance between fury and compassion as she supported Noah without smothering him, Victor recalibrating alliances with the cold efficiency of a man who understood that even monsters had once been useful, and through it all Sienna remained acutely aware that while Audra's downfall was necessary, it did not automatically restore what had been taken, because power leaves residue, and Audra's influence lingered in habits, in doubts, in the reflexive fear that she might still somehow be watching, orchestrating from the shadows, and there were nights when Sienna woke convinced she heard footsteps, moments when an unfamiliar car idling too long outside sent her heart racing, reminders that exposing someone like Audra came with a cost that extended far beyond the courtroom, and yet even in those moments she did not regret her choice, because she had seen something else emerging alongside the fear, a resilience she had not known she possessed, and in Noah too, who began physical therapy with renewed determination, no longer blaming himself for his limitations, no longer apologizing for pain that had been inflicted rather than earned, and one afternoon, as they sat together in the quiet of the rehabilitation center, Noah asked Sienna the question she had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure, asking why she had done it, why she had risked everything for the truth when it would have been easier to walk away, and Sienna answered honestly, saying that she had recognized something in Audra that frightened her not because it was powerful but because it was normalized, because it thrived on silence and rationalization, because too many people had accepted control masquerading as care, and she told him that she could not live with herself if she allowed that pattern to continue unchallenged, especially when it had nearly destroyed him, and Noah listened, absorbing this not as a debt but as an affirmation, and he told her that knowing the truth had given him something the accident had stolen, not just clarity but anger that was justified, anger that could be transformed into resolve instead of self-loathing, and as weeks turned into months, the case moved toward its conclusion, evidence stacking higher than Audra's denials, and when the verdict finally came, finding Audra culpable for orchestrating the accident and the subsequent manipulation, the courtroom erupted not in celebration but in a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been coiled for far too long, and Audra herself remained eerily composed as the sentence was read, her eyes scanning the room as if memorizing it, as if cataloging losses, and when her gaze found Sienna's, there was no longer threat there but something colder still, an emptiness that suggested Audra had finally encountered a reality she could not bend, and in the aftermath, life did not return to what it had been, because it never does after truth of that magnitude, but it moved forward in altered shapes, Noah reclaiming pieces of himself through effort and honesty, Sharon finding a deeper, steadier strength, Kyle learning that loyalty without scrutiny can be its own kind of harm, and Sienna stepping into a role she had never sought but could no longer deny, that of someone who had seen behind the curtain and refused to look away, and she knew that Audra's story would be analyzed endlessly, labeled as evil, sociopathic, monstrous, but Sienna also knew that the real lesson lay not just in Audra's actions but in how easily they had been concealed beneath charm, competence, and the language of love, and as she stood one evening watching the sun dip below the horizon, the world bathed briefly in a light that made even scars look softer, Sienna felt the weight of everything she had lost and gained settle into a quiet acceptance, because proving Audra was the mastermind behind Noah's accident had not made her a hero, had not erased the damage done, but it had drawn a line that could not be crossed again without resistance, and in that boundary, in that refusal to allow control to masquerade as destiny, Sienna found something she had not expected to claim for herself, not closure, not peace, but the unshakable certainty that silence would never again be an option, no matter how high the cost, because some truths, once known, demand to be lived as fiercely as they are spoken.